it's live on LinkedIn. We've got a few folks joining via Zoom as well. Either way, we're talking scaling with my man, Chuck Brotman. Chuck, I've had a chance to know you for quite some time now, since what was that? I think we were like a poke bowl place in San Francisco or something.
Right, yeah.
Was it the first
Future
time that
Rito, I think. Yeah.
we hung out?
Yep.
So cool. I'm looking forward to this. So Chuck and I've been, we've worked together Chuck was a client. Chuck's been working with Skaled now, and Chuck is now, starting and really kind of a new way to think about scaling. And so Chuck, I'll kind of let you maybe do a quick intro to you and what you've been up to, and kind of what's next for you. I know that there's a lot of really cool things that you and the team are up to, and I'm really excited that we're kind of partnering on some of this as well. So let everyone know about Blueprint and what you guys are up to, and I'm really pumped for the conversation today.
Yeah, Jake, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited as well. And as background for those of you I haven't met, so I'm Chuck Brotman. I've been in sales and sales management roles for the better part of the last 15 years. And I've been working with Skaled now for about 1.5 years as a consultant, but I've also started a company called Blueprint, really focused on helping mostly growth in startup companies to find, recruit, and onboard exceptional talent. And I've sort of discovered this passion for recruiting that I didn't know I fully had. I've obviously hired probably hundreds of people over the years as a hiring manager, as a sales leader, but now I'm helping other organizations find great talent and really enjoying it.
I love it, man. Yeah, and it's been fun. I've been a part of the journey since the formation of Blueprint to kind of watched how it's morphed. And I think some of the cool things, the way that you're thinking about it, that's different. And I've got friends running some big recruitment firms too. It's you're thinking about this as like, not just how do we hire the people, but how do we set them up for success, which is, kind of leads us to the topic for today, which is, as you're growing and scaling, how do you make sure you do it without, stepping on your, toes too much? And so I'm going to drop in here. And again, if you want to, if you're joining us on the Zoom, feel free, drop in the chat, just where, what your role is and what company you're from. Same thing for my folks on LinkedIn. If you want to just drop in like what your role is, we can really try to tailor this toward, hey, even if you're an individual contributor, talking about, hey, what should you be looking for as you're kind of taking your next opportunity too. So make sure to drop your questions as well. We love questions. So I'm going to say, drop your comments or questions here. So, all right. So we're going to get into we're going to talk mostly about kind of hiring today. And I think what I feel like, Chuck, is hiring is one of these non-sexy topics that, because it's kind of like, it's hard, I think a lot of people, when it comes to hiring, I think that they think it's very instinctive too. It's like, It's very much like, well, I know what made me good, etc. Here we go. All right, we've got Andrew Morton. What's up, Andrew? Hope you're doing good, man. Eric, what's going on, Eric? I'm looking forward to. I know we're catching up tomorrow, actually. So, Eric, I'm glad that you joined as well. Let's see, on the LinkedIn side, we've got Mario. Oh, we got Mario from Serbia. I love this. Robert's looking to grow from 2 to 10 people. So again, all my LinkedIn folks, we've got 13 or so people on LinkedIn. Tell us a little bit about your situation. Are you trying to grow? Are you trying to scale too? Tell us where you're at with your team, and Chuck and I can really try to tailor a bunch of this conversation. So Chuck, I'm going to start with the high level here, which is, what do you think are some of the challenges when you're going through this first phase of scaling? And I'll even be more specific for those folks out there. It's like, we've got some people that are doing that. They're growing from 0 to 10 reps, or from 5 to 10, and then we'll go from like 10 to 20 or 30 and talk about that. But let's sit here and park it for a second. When companies are growing from that kind of 0 to 10, what are the typical challenges that you see? What are companies that are the pitfalls? And then what are the companies that are, crushing it? What do you see them doing?
Yeah, I think you said it really well there earlier in terms of this notion of it being instinctive, which I don't think is totally wrong, but I think a lot of the problems and challenges with hiring, start there, particularly for companies that want to go from 0 or 1 to 5 and beyond. Everyone wants to replicate their best rep, whether it's that first founding account executive and or a CEO or founder who's been really effective at selling.
Yeah.
But beyond that, right, there's a lot of work to be done, even going from 0 to 5, to get things right. And even like missed assumptions anywhere along the way can really impact you downstream, right? So, first and foremost, have you really defined, your addressable market, your ideal client profile? Do you know specifically, what the product market fit is there. I think a lot of companies are doing a much better job of that before they start hiring.
Why do you think that's so important, Chuck? I had a really interesting, I'm not going to, it's super timely. I actually had a conversation this morning, my first call this morning. I dropped my kids off at summer camp for the first time, which was like a whole ordeal. Chuck, I know you've been going through that for a while. And I was talking to him, and it's interesting. This guy had been at a company for a long time and went to a completely different industry, different buyer persona, different. So why do you think knowing your customer is important for hiring at this stage? And then I'll kind of tell more of my story, but it's kind of funny how I had that conversation earlier, and it's you're bringing this up now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamentally understanding that, when you start hiring, right, you really want to understand what's the market that you want to go after, and how do you translate that into a profile of the kind of the skills and behaviors that you're looking for, and someone who can go after that with consistency and vigor, right? I mean, particularly when
and who has experience doing it, Chuck. I think that's what you're getting at, is that I'll tell you the kind of mistake here is like, look, if you realize that your buyer is a maybe slightly less sophisticated buyer, it's not really an enterprise sale, it's a mid-market, you want to hire for people that have that experience.
Yep.
And I just see the big issue I see, Chuck, is at that early stage, people think that sales is sales, and if you sold here, you can sell there. And which, look, if you're an A+ player, I think that's true, that you can do that after lots of years of at bats. But that's what I see. That's why I think knowing your customer is so important. That if you don't know that, you're going to mishire. You're going to mishire on a VP for sure. You're going to mishire on other roles too.
Yeah, totally. And I think, and I know Skaled published a guide to like building your ideal candidate profiles, which I think is so important. Another step that I think that companies often miss, that kind of oddly can cause people to be both kind of too broad, but also too narrow in their search, right? And by that I mean, when you really understand the market that you want to pursue, the nature of the deals, the sales cycle, and translate that into a set of skills and behaviors you're interviewing for, that helps the best hiring managers can then go broader and find great talent that other people are skipping. And the example I use a lot is really, people who get overly obsessed with SaaS experience as a keyword for the experience they need.
Oh yeah.
Right. I mean, I think SaaS background is great.
Have you sold SaaS?
Have you sold SaaS? Right?
Oh, how many years of SaaS experience do you have?
So people start using that as a shorthand for the skills they need, when the reality is that often tells you very little. So you've got so many companies that are chasing a relatively narrow set of I'll put skills in quotes, in a very tight market. And then you've got tremendously talented people that probably have the better skills that you need, who are often, getting less attention on the market, right? So I think that step is also so important, that you really identify, knowing your market, but then what does that mean in terms of the skills and behaviors, right, that you're looking for? And then what is your hiring process, right? And what I find really interesting, going back to that 0 to 5, is so many companies now understand that they need to have a sales process, and they're building that earlier than they were 5-10 years ago.
I agree.
Right,
yeah,
they're getting
100%.
better tools in place, but they're not setting up a basic hiring process. They're kind of assuming when they find those great people that the CEO would just lob a call and they can close them. And particularly in this market, it doesn't work that way. You need to have a process there. You need to take candidate experience seriously, but you also have to have clear guidelines on how you go from that initial sourcing step to your interview process, to closing the right people, and then, as you said earlier, to onboarding them to be successful and minimize that ramp time. So.
It's so spot on. I think, what I always akin both of these to hiring engineers, which is like, when you hire an engineer, you put them through the ringer. They do this test. They usually build like a sample project and all these things. And then whenever you hire that engineer, you're like, this is how we write code. This is the playbook. This is how you do it. This is what we do and what we don't do that might be different from your previous roles. For some reason, sales, we are convinced, is the exact opposite.
Right.
It's like, just talk about what you've done in the past. You've done some sales. Oh, you've done sales. Here's Salesforce. Like, just go. And I think, to your point, Chuck, because I definitely agree. I think over the last 9 months, as we're kind of starting this process of coming out of COVID, I think I've seen that focus on, okay, yeah, maybe we should have a playbook maybe earlier than we did before, because we do want to be a little bit more methodical about growth. But to your point, I still don't think we're there in the hiring process. I think at that 0 to 5, and then even 5 to 15, I still feel like it's loose. And do you feel like that's a candidate? Is it about the candidate profile or the interview experience itself? Like, what do you think is the main, kind of culprit here?
I mean, Probably all of it, but
Yeah, sure.
where I've seen companies missing the most, it really is that interview process. And speaking now, as you know, with my kind of recruiter hat on, and it's funny because thinking back, I remember, external recruiting firms kind of, coaching me on the importance of having clear process and SLAs. But it's just amazing how often companies are losing exceptional talent because they don't have that in place, right? They're not getting to applicants, fast enough, right? The same companies that know the importance of responding to qualified leads fast, right, are letting, great applicants or even internal referrals sit in their queue and not get an initial interview scheduled. They're having initial screens and then not having appropriate next steps, having a trained panel that then engages them. And then the worst thing of all, right, is that you've got candidates that everyone signs off on, but some companies haven't defined the process for actually closing them, making that verbal offer, and then getting the paperwork to them expeditiously. And in this market, that's just killing companies, right? Those that can't execute, they're basically oftentimes inadvertently conveying to those candidates, like, we're not really sure you're the right person for us. And
Yeah.
those people have choices, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good call out of just documenting the process and sticking to it,
Yep.
And I think that's it with so much, even your first sales playbook, when you're going that 0 to 15, just even if you have a documented process, and then you can optimize that, right?
Totally.
Without it, you're just kind of, doing that, kind of like based on gut. And so let's maybe dig into the interviewing process, right? Again, it goes back to, I feel like, and I even think back to my first VP of sales job. I mean, Chuck, you've been there too, man. It's like there's a pressure, when you're scaling early on, especially if you've raised a shit ton of money, right? Where you're just, you're getting the pressure of like, Jake, here's what our what our quota looks like. Here's what your here's what your hiring plan looks like bodies. Like we need that. I'll tell a quick story. Oh God, this is horrible. But I'll tell it just so I think some people can probably relate. This is before I was a VP of sales, as a sales manager in a fast growing group within a bigger company. And the recruiter, I'd interviewed 2 Jennifers. Okay. And I went to the recruiter and I said, okay, yeah, hey, I think I dinged one of them like the day before. I said, yeah, go ahead and make the offer to Jennifer. And he had made the offer to the other Jennifer that I had dinged. Okay. And she's like, oh, she accepted. And then I was like, what? I was like, no, you're supposed to make the offer to this one. And he's like, oh, okay. Oh man, I'm sorry. Like, I think we just got our wires crossed. So I go to my director, my boss. He's like, fuck it, we need bodies. And so he made me hire this. And of course she flamed out in like 6 weeks, right? Like it was not good. But, I think a lot of sales leaders, you kind of like skirt the interview process because you do need people. And, so I've been there, Chuck. I'm sure you've had to make some decisions from time to time early on that, sometimes pan out, sometimes they cost you. But what do you feel like in that interview process are some of the most key details there?
Yeah, I mean, at a fundamental, I think back in my career, and I've obviously made some great hires over the years, but I also got this wrong so many times. And fundamentally, I think that the big issue is not having your process documented and really down to like the way that you're assessing candidates to each step. I actually believe really strongly it's important to have your questions and topics documented in advance. And similar to, I think, in sales training, right, there's growing, I think, consensus that like building scripts for how you run initial calls, how you run discovery, that's okay, right? Having scripts doesn't mean you're going to be scripted in your approach, but it means you've got a clear plan to go from point A to point B. And that is so important in hiring, right? If you're walking into an interview and just thinking, well, my gut is stronger than anything, I'll spot talent. First of all, you're more likely to let unconscious bias, influence those decisions, but you're also like overestimating your own ability to find greatness. And in this market, it's crippling, right?
Everyone should listen to that right there. We're at minute 14, second 30. I think that concept of having a script, it is shot, especially because we're talking about that 0 to 5, the 5 to 15, that early stages of growing. I cannot, what percent of companies do you think, Chuck, actually have a script for their people at this stage?
I think it's very small.
10, 20%?
Right.
That's what I'd guess.
But also some of those companies that have, maybe they use a script. I think it's also important that you have that built out for anyone you bring in your process, right? I mean, those people should get training before you involve anybody in an interview process. And I think some people might hear this and think, well, we need to move fast. We're a startup. Totally understand that. Been there, done that. But moving fast doesn't mean you don't take the time to train people who are going to participate in your hiring process. What are the skills and behaviors you're looking for, and how do we assess for that, right? And when you do that front end work and build out those forms or those interview questions, that also helps you go further faster, right? Because when you're assessing, particularly for AEs and more senior hires, there's a lot you want to look for. You don't want to be redundant, have the same people coming in, asking the same questions, and then leaving a bunch to not get addressed at all, right? That's how you make mistakes that end up adversely impacting execution and culture. So I think it needs to be planned out. It needs to be done on the front end, and you need to make sure that everybody's following to a certain level a script or playbook.
Yep.
To make sure you're getting great people.
How many of you, you can put a thumbs up or a clap hands or something on LinkedIn, or you can put a thumbs up in the chat on Zoom. How many of you, have had AEs or other people go in an interview, and again, they just ask the same questions? How many of you have seen an interview process where the AEs come in and, they, again, like to your point, it's like there's been no training. Yeah. It's like, oh yeah, you know what makes a good person. I mean, just think about the insanity we're talking about here. Yeah. Like, of what we're talking about from a hiring standpoint, that we're talking about bringing people on, not training the people that, we have brought on to do this. But that's a whole other issue, Chuck. We could do a whole session just on the lack of managerial training at yeah. growth stage companies, about how we overinvest on onboarding for frontline people. And then our our new frontline leaders were like, oh yeah, like just do the job. Yeah. Which is a whole other kind of shit show that I see time and time again. So what I hear with the interviewing, just to kind of like recap, it's, have a process, make sure you've kind of trained the people that are going to actually talk to people, etc. That to me is a big one as a part of this. Yeah. So someone's got a question here that we can double click on. TR does. What does your interview process look like? More specifically, how many interviews, rounds, calls, what other team members are included? TR, my man, I love this question because we're going to get tactical. My friends on Zoom, I'm going to copy and paste this over. And then I want to get to, there's another question. We're talking about hiring for like the Rolodex, which I've got a whole slew of ideas on that. So I'll start, Chuck, and I'll talk. I know me and you have a lot of philosophical similarities around interviewing process. Our process at Skaled is pretty straightforward. And we do it almost universally, and then we create some different projects depending on the role. But for us, there's a great set of books. And for everybody listening, we've got about 40 people across platforms now. There's an amazing set of books that all of you should read. And it's by this father-son combo, Jeff Smart. I can't remember what the dad's name. He might be Jeff Smart Jr. or Senior. I don't know. But it's a book called Who, W-H-O. And there's a book that his dad wrote called Power Score, or Top Grading. And then another book that Jeff Smart wrote called Power Score. And what I have found is that combining these techniques has really tightened it up for us. And so I can just kind of walk you through like our adapted process. TR also asked the follow-on culture fit versus skills. Matt Bress actually had a really sweet comment on this. He said, questions can't be culture fit. He or she needs to be a culture add. And I was like, ooh, that is really, really good. So our process is straightforward. We have a very set script for a screening interview that happens. If it's a job where we're getting a ton, we actually do a brief video. It's like a 3-minute, 5-minute video questionnaire that we ask people to do. Then we basically have a set screening questionnaire that we allow people that we walk through. That call is usually 30 to 45 minutes. Then what we've done is we've created this massive role scorecard. Okay, this has like a list of about 30 plus skills for individuals and another probably 20 for managers. Each one of those skills is ranked tagged either green, yellow, or red, which means red is like, this is a really difficult skill to change. Integrity. There's some other ones like, work ethic, like certain things. Yellow means it can be changed, but it's hard. And green means it's really easily coachable. Then for each role, we basically assign a score for how important, and we basically pick about 10 of those skills that are core, most important for this role. How important to this role is this? Is it a 4? Is it a 3? And you really want to avoid 5s because there should be like very few actual 5s. And that's where we kind of get like a scientific score. It's like, okay, for this role, we want to move people to the next round that score above a 15 or score above a 12 or whatever the scoring mechanism is. And then we have a very set experience interview. And I really feel like this interview, and again, this is straight from the book, this interview, Chuck, I think for us has really been the game changer, which the experience interview, we ask the same 5 questions and we go back in time. If you've had 8 jobs, we will most likely go back to your 8th job. And what we do is we say, why did you take the role? What was the high point? What was the low point? When I talk to your boss, how are they going to rate you on a scale of 1 to 10 and why? How you phrase that question has a direct impact on the quality of the answer. And why did you leave? Sometimes we'll ask in there, like, tell me about a time you received tough feedback. We'll kind of loop that in. And then we go to the next role and the next role, and we ask the same questions. And what you start to see is a pattern of behavior. This person built this thing. Oh, and then they built this thing. Oh, this person's boss was an asshole. Oh, guess what? Their next boss was an asshole. And their next boss. And you start to see these patterns. So TR, that's our process. Screening interview, scorecard, experience. And then sometimes, again, depending on the role, we'll also have some type of project that would happen after the experience interview. So Chuck, what do you like? What would you add to that?
No, I think that's awesome. I really like that experience piece, which I'm obviously familiar with working with you all. But what's great about that, these days, there are so many companies that have strong opinions on hoppiness, right? And many companies that we've worked with who simply won't screen somebody based on 3 jobs in 3 years, right? And I understand that at a certain level, right? No one wants to hire somebody that can't see through certain commitments, or obviously who can't execute it at a high level. But what I love about that experience concept is it's a very structured way to kind of go through that and ask those questions and make an assessment, determine, is this in fact somebody who, maybe was in
they got laid off once, and then it was this, right? And then it was this. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and I also like about this whole process that you outlined there, which is it kind of gets into another topic altogether, but there's a degree of kind of curiosity about the candidate that's reflected in there that I think is also important. So many companies tend to make everything about themselves, often inadvertently, right? We're great. We just closed X dollars, X fund, right? Which again, get in line these days, right? Everyone's raising money.
Everyone closed X dollars.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's great. People certainly want to see that, but what are you doing in your process to really show your curiosity and in fact be curious about the candidates and really looking at interviewing as a two-way street. And I think that's the kind of process where you're going to get to the heart of whether somebody's a candidate you want to bring in your organization, but you're also doing it in a very thoughtful and consistent way. And what I also like about that too, and I know someone had a question about kind of the Rolodex versus non-Rolodex.
Yeah. Let's get into that one next.
Be consistent, right? I mean, I've got a network I'm proud of. I've built up over the years, and I've made some great hires and referred people that have been hired. But I expect those candidates get treated as consistently as anyone who's applying from the outside. And I think as long as you're consistent there, and build that process, you can certainly move with speed, right? Process doesn't mean you're slowing down and losing opportunity. It's process should enable speed, but also be consistent in how you use that.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about so you're hiring for the Rolodex. I think early on, a lot of companies want to do this, right? Yeah. They're like, our first few hires need to come from, the Rolodex or the industry. What's your philosophy around that, Chuck? What's your philosophy around hiring the Rolodex?
I mean, I think certainly there are specific sales where that can make sense as a data point, but in general, and I've written about this in the past, so many companies, I think, make more mistakes by getting overly focused on hiring for an industry versus defining those skills and behaviors, right? And at a certain level, I mean, you think about it, right? If somebody's worked for your top competitor and they're back on the market, right? You ought to be maybe a little curious about, why they want to go to, a competitive company that's maybe doesn't have the same market share. And there could be very good reasons for that. So I don't think you want to necessarily screen those people out, but you also don't want to just assume that that's where you want to put your focus. And if you have a strong process and the tools in place and the playbook to enable reps to learn the business, to take your value proposition out to market and build pipeline, I think hiring for a Rolodex these days is frankly a little antiquated.
Yeah, I love that. You actually mentioned something in there that there are certain industries where I found is if your TAM, your total addressable market, is very narrow.
Yep.
Like very, 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 very narrow. Maybe there's only a few hundred buyers in the world. Maybe, again, I'm talking like institutional investing,
right.
Certain types of fintech in particular. or, again, the enterprise layer is only 200 companies. But also, you mentioned this about stage, and I'll again tell a story about me screwing up again. But when I was at, it's also about the stage that you're in. Meaning,
Yep.
if you're a smaller company and you're that 0 to 15 company where you're early stage, and you're like, oh, we'll hire someone from the big player, and because they know the space or they have a Rolodex. We'll rewind back to Glassdoor. I did that. I hired these people who'd been at Monster and these other places, and I, all over in the regions, and they failed.
Yep.
One out of 4 stuck. And what we found is that our sale was different. Like, our sale was very qualitative. It's like, look, you're looking for people. This is how people are looking right now. It's not like, hey, we're this big player. Because keep in mind, if you sell Salesforce or these people, there's no education of the market that needs to be done. There's no this. So I am always hesitant. I always say this. I overly scrutinize the Rolodex people. I actually make it, if they think that they want this job because they worked in this space and the Rolodex, versus they understand how what we do is different, it could be completely different, and we're never going to use their Rolodex. Because what I find consistently is the Rolodex is only good for the first 6 months anyway.
Right.
and unfortunately, what tends to happen too is a lot of people's Rolodex is a lot thinner than they actually think it is. And for those of you who don't know what a Rolodex is, just an FYI, a Rolodex, my friend, is this old school. It used to be this thing. And what you would do is you'd put business cards in it, and it would twirl. You could staple a business, you kind of flip through the names. So that's what a Rolodex is for all of you. Chuck, I realized we probably needed to find that. I had talked about this before, and someone was like, "What's a Rolodex?" And I was like, "Fuck, we're old." I
had to define carrying a bag for someone earlier, so I know that feeling.
God, yeah, carrying a bag. That's a good one. So that's my thought on the Rolodex is, like, I think, and again, I've seen it be successful. It's a super hyper niche. But for the other people, just think about the stage that you're at. If you're a company that's going to need to educate the market, hiring from a bigger competitor may not be the right fit because they actually don't know how to sell like that. They're used to calling in saying, hey, I'm with Salesforce. I'm with LinkedIn. I'm with insert industry incumbent, and so, they're not used to having to pitch value. Everyone knows what they do. They know who they are. And so I would just really warn people about hiring for the Rolodex and just be cautious that it's not I think, Chuck, to your point, that it's like a factor in the hiring process, not the factor.
Exactly.
All right. So, let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to go with this one first. You talked a little bit about unconscious bias in the interview process. I think for me, like a lot of sales leaders, it can feel, it's very kind of homogenous in many sales organizations, right? A lot of white aggressive dudes, right? Which is kind of what has been like the archetype for a lot of sales organizations in the past. And, I think when I talk to, older white sales leaders, male too, right? I think a lot of it is, again, it's that term unconscious, right? You don't realize that some of the questions you're asking, hey, did you play sports in college? Did you do this? Oh, tell me where you grew up. They don't kind of understand how all of these types of questions can introduce all kinds of biases, and I've had many conversations with, with a variety of different groups that are not the archetype. And there's so many things that you don't even realize that you may or may not be doing. And so, Chuck, what are some ways that people can start to remove, or at least be aware of, some of these unconscious biases in the interviewing, hiring, and onboarding?
Yeah, I think you give some great examples there. And I think at a certain level, it's really about just understanding that there's a reason we call it unconscious bias, right? We're not talking about people, going into the process saying, I want to hire for traditional demographics and maintain that exclusivity, right? Most of us understand these things are big social problems, but I think fundamentally understanding that there are so many ways this manifests itself that we're not always aware of, and really understanding how that impacts our ability to build high performing organizations, right? That's to me the key thing. I mean, there's obviously a lot of attention, rightfully so, to the social importance of building organizations that look like the population at large. Putting that totally aside, though, right? If you want to build teams that are actually performing at a high level, I want to make sure I don't have any bias in my process as much as possible, right? And so I think it goes back to the things that we discussed, right? Documenting the questions you want to use to assess for skills and behaviors. Making sure that you put everyone through, formal interview training before they participate in your process. I started thinking about this stuff years ago when I noted that frankly, probably over 50% of the top sellers I knew in the organization at the time were women, yet, 95% of the people who were making it through a process were men. Like, I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
get in front of that, right? And it's not like I was, like trying to do a social good for its own sake. I want to build a team that executed well. And so, I think as we think about how, the profession of sales has changed, I know, Jake, you've talked so much about this in so many contexts, but, if you want to build a modern sales organization that's performing well, I mean, you want to be as mindful as you can of bias and get it out of your process, right? And I think in doing so, you will end up building teams that are more diverse and that execute at a higher level.
Yeah, and I think that it goes back to the combination of it when you have kind of your scripting or your messaging. What you can really start to do is just think about it, right? Just think about that, right? Just start to think about, okay, this question, is this leading, am I leading toward an outcome
Yeah.
that I'm looking, that is then going to validate some of these unconscious biases that I may or may not. And I think that goes back to why writing things out and training people is so important, right? It's like, there's all kinds of questions. Like, think about like, especially I think about, some questions around like, oh, do you have kids? Oh, do you have,
Yep.
no, we don't, but we just got married. And then all of a sudden you're like, uh-oh, is she going to be out on maternity leave? These are the things that unconsciously we don't realize when we ask like some of these questions that just, candidly, some of them are borderline illegal, or even if they're not illegal, they're going to lead you to, kind of go down a different path. And, I feel like so often it might seem, I think some people are like, well, I'm just making small talk or that. It's like, well, when you're the person on the other side, that's not how it's interpreted. And I think for, a lot of people, they don't, again, that's why it's called unconscious, is like, it's like, well, okay, well, yeah, maybe if I was a, 28-year-old woman who just got married a year ago, and maybe I don't want to talk about that because I don't want to be, I feel like I'm going to get discriminated against. And I think that that's a perfect example. I mean, you talk to a lot of women and they are terrified to talk about, any of that stuff and kids or anything in the interview process because they're worried that there may be some type of, disqualification and other details.
I think the other big thing too that I would add that I'm most aware of these days is, I've written about age bias, which I think is a huge issue that's still understated. Frankly, that is kind of much more out there in some cases than it should be. But fundamentally, how we think about somebody's narrative when we're interviewing them. And again, going back, I love that experience interview you're doing, where you're giving people, a fair opportunity to account for their experience. What I've seen is that so many hiring managers, they're biased towards a certain narrative, right? Show me someone who, went to, an Ivy League or
played lacrosse. Definitely, they're going to say played lacrosse or field hockey.
Right.
That's going to come up.
They went from university, they went straight into, an SDR role. Within 2 years, they got promoted. They got promoted again. And hey, those can be outstanding candidates. I'm not saying we don't want to look at opportunities for individuals like that, but then you've got somebody who, maybe didn't go to university or went to a community college, maybe did time in the military, maybe was in a totally different industry and worked there for 5, 6, 7 years, then moved to sales development. Those people are not getting the same opportunities, and it's wrong, and it's not good for organizations. If you want to build a high-performing organization, I want to talk to those people. And frankly, that experience and those people who maybe have had more friction in their lives, that's how you strengthen organizations and execute better. But those people, I don't think, are getting the opportunities they should.
I agree. And I think that, step one is, again, if you document your process and you think about it, you then can go and assess, okay, well, how are we doing here? How are we doing here? Go talk to some of the, the candidates that you have that are of a more diverse profile that have, that you have ended up hiring, and go talk to them about their experience. What can you do better? Again, what was onboarding like for you? What was, because it's not just about the interview. I think about it, it's like the holistic experience at your company. It just kind of starts with the interviewing and hiring, and how do we make sure that more people get, kind of get through, to your point, Chuck, that don't fit that, kind of stereotypical bias or stereotypical archetype that we've kind of created. Switching gears a bit here, we've got a couple of questions that have come in around who should be involved. On who is this on? I think he has JP on LinkedIn talked about, engaging the broader team, peers interviewing. And then I think a couple other folks, I think it was, Rob talked about getting product or other departments. I think this is a really common, early stage, 0 to 15 hiring thing. It's like everybody interviews this person.
Right.
And I'll give my take is people, again, train them how to interview. There's nothing worse for a candidate than, like, again, you bring in the product person and this person and this person, and they ask the same questions.
Right.
Again, what we do, I could just get everyone to give some tactical tips. What we'll do in those scenarios where we really want someone like really vetted by peers is give each person 3 or 4 of the skills. Give these 2 people are going to interview around these 3 or 4 skills. I don't want to talk about any of these other things. Just focus here. These people are here. And so we've kind of broke up the skills interview we don't do it with every candidate, but from time to time when we do want to loop people in. But, what do you think about it, Chuck? Like looping other people into the interview process, what works, what doesn't work?
I think you said it perfectly. I think you have to, whatever you do, it has to be done with thoughtful intent and defined in advance. It shouldn't be about, throwing bodies at a candidate or just like, giving the whole company a chance to participate for its own sake, which, I've seen so often. But when it's done well, and I totally understand it, at a small company, particularly when you're making your first sales hires, you want to make sure those people will work well cross-functionally, right? And so I totally understand the intent behind that. But like, you also want to think about the candidate experience. You also want to think about what are the skills and behaviors that you need their help assessing for. How are they going to do that? And then I think the last thing too is you also need to make sure that you're clear with your panelists what their stake is in the outcome, right? So what you don't want to do is you have someone participate, tell them, hey, your feedback's really valuable, and then you end up making hires that they say are not great fits for the organization, right? And they're then feeling perturbed and like their voice hasn't been heard. So these things can also backfire. So you want to have all that laid out, I think, from how you go from start to how final decisions get made, and socialize that with anyone who's participating in the process. And then, as you said, like, just be really thoughtful about what they're asking and where their assessment fits into the overall decision making.
Yeah, because what I feel like happens with a lot of this, where you've got other people interviewing, is it just turns into a big culture question. Right. Everyone, it's not about the skills of the person. It's like, do I like this person? I'm not going to have to work with them day to day. I'm going to kind of have to work with them here or there. So is this like a person it goes back to kind of the beer test. Like, is this more of a person I want to have a beer with? Or maybe if you're not into beer, is this person like I could like talk to on my lunch break, as opposed to what are the skill sets we're actually looking for? And can I help to add that? But, and I think that can kind of lead to our next question, which is about the idea of culture add or culture, fit. And, I think early on, again, especially hiring 0 to 15, right? These variables are more in play when you have, you're adding one person to a team of 200. It's the bucket is much bigger. So any type of pebble makes a bigger wave, when you drop it into a bucket. How do you think about screening for culture? And it might not be maybe screening is even the wrong word. How do you think about hiring for culture?
Yeah, I love that phrase, culture add, whoever proposed that. I think, most companies have, obviously a company culture that they've put together, and that's important from an executive level, on down and on up. And I think there certainly is an opportunity to take that culture and to build assessments for candidates on and maybe to avoid using the word fit, on how well they'll thrive in an organization like that, right? And so I think there is a place for looking at your company culture and building assessments against that in your process. But as we've been discussing, right, making sure that's documented and that doesn't become an excuse for, as you said, like, is this someone that I could have beers with? Or, I suspect in some cases you've got organizations who are coming in and almost assessing for, hey, is this somebody who's going to help like simmer down the sales org so they're not as difficult for us to work with, right? And actually, working against you in some cases, right? So whatever it is, just being thoughtful about it and documenting it. And if it's about assessing for company culture, building that in, and that can be difficult, right? If you ask somebody, hey, what do you think about our values? If someone wants that job, they're going to say it sounds great, but there's a way to write those questions so that you're really getting thoughtfulness out of that, and assessing that just has to be done in advance.
Yeah. And what are some ways to do that? Like, what are some ways you feel, you can better assess for culture. I mean, for me, I think it's about maybe just coming up with some questions around your values and norms,
Yep.
right? It could be around, okay, so your value, for a Scaled, right? One of our values is work smart. So if we're really assessing, it's about, hey, whenever you get handed a project, how do you think about managing that project? And it's more of like, we're kind of looking for the culture fit within some of the skills questions.
Yep.
And I think that's probably how we, I think, try to address it. But I'm sure there's got to be better ways. Like, Chuck, what do you think are some better ways companies can, inject kind of culture add into their process without it, again, being about unconscious bias, the type of people that I like and look like me or act like me versus, actually a really strong culture add?
Yeah, I mean, I like what you're doing there from the scale perspective. I think getting tactical for a minute, sometimes it's about if I'm helping to write or comment on questions that panelists are using in my process, I'll often include, in the ATS itself, what a great answer looks like and what's problematic. And then I want to get their buy-in before they do that process. So, because that also enables them to then go deeper and ask clarifying questions because they really want to get to the substance of, is this somebody who's going to strengthen and add to our culture versus someone who's going to be, yellow, red flag material, right? So I think it's putting those questions in advance and providing some guidance on what we're looking for. And
I love that.
I'll even say for some questions like, look, there's not necessarily a wrong answer here, right? But you get them talking, document that response, and then we kind of assess afterwards in terms of how this comports with everything else we know about that candidate. So.
I think that's a great call out, right? It's just like, it would be really easy for, I think it's like when you do it around like technical skills, right? That becomes easier. It's like, well, what are you looking for? Salesforce experience, right? Or whatever. I think but again, like when you think about things like culture, I think, maybe defining it for people is something tactically that everyone kind of tuning in could think about that, if I want to, what does this mean to live this value or to live this norm or whatever that looks like. So I think that's a great one. Anything else, Chuck? Around ways to kind of help people to do a more subjective or less subjective job of hiring around culture?
I think just adding, I mentioned kind of ATS, but making sure that everyone is in fact putting their feedback in whatever that system is, right? And there are plenty of systems out there, but getting rigorous about people submitting their assessments, and I think holding people accountable if they're part of the process to do it in a timely fashion, right? It shouldn't be coming a week after the fact or after having to to push them to share their feedback. If they want to be a part of the process, if you want them involved, like they should take it seriously and get those results to you, when you need them.
Yeah. So again, it's like we're taking it seriously.
Exactly.
Like this isn't just to give us your anecdote.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. All right, we've got a good question here from Andrew. What's up, Andrew? Hope you're doing great, man. Again, and we've got we'll probably go for another 10 minutes or so, folks. So make sure keep dropping the questions in. We're getting some good ones here. So I think that this is, again, we're talking about this 0 to 15 hiring, right? So we're hiring our first, 5, 10, 15 salespeople. And this thing he talked about, which is like, how can you figure out in the interview process if a candidate has a figure it out, get shit done mentality? So let me drop this into LinkedIn for everyone else. And I think we've got another question here in the Q&A too, that we'll hop on. So this, to me, especially in sales, this is the one, if you have a weak process, these people get through all the time.
Yep.
Right. It's that attitude, right? I've never interviewed someone and you're like, would you describe yourself as like a self-starter? Like,
Right.
Has anybody ever said no? Has anyone ever been like, nah, I actually need like a kick in the ass? Like, nah, I'm not really a self-starter. I actually just like really specific instructions and like, I'll kind of do like an 80% job. Like, so I just feel like there's some of these stupid ass questions that like, it's the same thing as like when people ask in a sales call, like, does that make sense? And of course, everyone says like, yes, it makes sense. So how do you actually screen for that in the interview? How do you actually know if that person, again, you're at that 0 to 15. So like, you do need people who are a little bit resourceful.
Right.
And so what are the things that you do in the interview process that help to find out, again, like either how much of that mentality they actually have?
Yeah, two things. So first of all, I would say that I do feel like at times companies do use this phrase as a substitute for actually having a solid onboarding and enablement process. And so
Right.
search for that, but like make sure,
right.
Are you asking that and sort of obsessed with that because you don't have the ability to ensure that people have the resources and support to be successful? Because that's an important checkpoint there. But assuming you have, and look, this is like you said, Jake, resourcefulness is something that I think most startups, want to index for. This is a great example where I think having candidates do a 30, 60, 90 can be extremely valuable, right? Because to your point, you're not asking someone if they would describe themselves as a figure things out person. Everyone's going to say yes. But when you ask someone to, in that final step to put together a plan for their first 3 months or their first 6 months, that's going to give
Right.
you a real opportunity to see how are they thinking about their success and the resources they need versus the initiative they're going to take to make sure that they're moving as fast as possible, right? So I think, looking at this as a late stage exercise, I've actually seen, the 30, 60, 90 has been the stage in my hiring processes where I've found the best candidates, often those that I otherwise was kind of on the fence about. And conversely, it's been a place where candidates that otherwise I thought were exceptional, fell on their faces. And it's often because they did not show an initiative, an ability that I thought was needed in my organization to be resourceful and to get things done.
Yeah, I love that. And what I'll add to that too is, so it's some type of project. And then the other piece is, again, in the experience interview, meaning what will happen is, people that have that kind of get shit done mentality, what you'll hear job over job over job is like, there wasn't a process and I did blah, blah, blah. Or I saw this project that needed and I did that. What'll happen is you'll start to see themes of them demonstrating it. You never ask a person a question, how would you handle it? It's tell me about a time you did do it. And what you want is people who have demonstrated they've done it. And then the other piece that I would add to that, Andrew, is in the reference calls. Meaning I feel like that one of the dumbest things that people do is that they really treat reference calls like a throwaway.
Yeah.
And we've dinged people at the reference call stage. We've had people go through the whole thing and spend hours of my own time and other people's times. And then we have the conversations on the reference calls. And, the other thing is like, look, we don't ask them for their references typically. Sometimes we'll do it in certain cases, but in almost every case, instead we say, okay, so you mentioned your boss was Sam Smith. Can you intro me to Sam Smith so I can talk to him? And A+ candidates are like, absolutely. And obviously, look, it's okay if people have had a bump or here or there, right? So I think that use those reference calls to really understand, how much direction, and you'll just hear it in their voice. Like when you talk to 3 or 4 people that have talked to you, look, honestly, I didn't have to manage this. They just like, and then you hear that patterns again. So for me, I just look for patterns of them demonstrating that behavior and then validating that on the or validating or invalidating that based on the reference calls.
Totally.
That I ask for. All right, so we've got a question here. We'll take actually what we'll do here is if anyone else wants to drop some questions, we'll take a couple questions and we'll start to kind of wrap up. One of Andrew's questions was, we were talking about unconscious bias and making sure we have a more diverse, workforce, especially talking about sales. The question was, have you found any effective ways to attract a more diverse candidate base when recruiting? Step one is you have to be intentional about it. Yeah. Right. And what does that mean based on a job or a role that you might have? Because it's actually more of a role specific or department specific question, at least in my opinion, than it is. And then that kind of sums up to an organizational. But I think like my advice, Andrew, is that you have to be very intentional about it. For us, like we have thresholds that for each role based on a department and kind of the typical role leader profile, we have a certain amount of diverse candidates that we want to make sure get at least to like the second round or further. And so for me, I've just found that when you're intentional about it and you set some kind of bars and thresholds internally, that's what I feel like institutionalizes it for the team.
Yep, I think that's right. I also think too, particularly when the best organizations, right, are often, when they have senior roles opening up, they're promoting from within, and a lot of that initial hiring focus is more for those junior and entry level roles, sales development roles, et cetera. I think that's where you really have an opportunity to just make sure your process is open and inclusive as possible. And obviously there's software and tech out there to help with that, to make sure you're avoiding using words that maybe have a little bit of bias to them or overstating qualifications, which has been shown to impact diversity goals as well. So really looking at that front end of your process. I think making sure that you're open to applicants through all channels. We all obviously want to like move fast when we have internal referrals, which can be the best hires. But when you have somebody who applies to your website, making sure that you're as fast and getting back to them as any other channel, that's often where companies, in my experience, are losing opportunities to diversify. Because remember, our networks reflect how we've grown and been raised, and that can impact diversity as well. So
that's interesting. Yeah, I like that. Again, making sure that you're on top of all channels the same way as again, the channels that you may be getting like what you're used to. I think that's a great call out. So we've got a couple of questions here. These are some great ones. We've got one from Mohammed, one from Thomas on Zoom here. I'm going to take Thomas's first. He says, we're in the process of hiring a CRO. At the same time, we need to hire 7 to 8 new sales directors to be ready and ramped by Jan 1, 2022. The team is currently 3 sales directors. Question is, wait till the new CRO is in place a couple of months, or just keep going hiring the team? Chuck, advice here.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think I think in general these days there are so many options for interim sales leadership that you certainly want to have some guidance in terms of supporting the hiring and not slowing down when possible. Obviously, when you're bringing a leader in, it can be valuable for that leader to know they have an opportunity to shape and grow that team. But I don't know, Jake, you might have more to add on this. I think these days there's just more options available for companies that maybe need some interim leadership while they're waiting for that CRO.
Yeah, maybe there's like a hybrid. But if you had to pick, what advice would you tell Thomas? Wait 2 months or hire now?
I would wait 2 months.
Okay, Chuck says wait 2 months. All right. So yeah, what Chuck's alluding to, so we do a lot of interim VP of sales work at Skaled. So obviously, thank you, Chuck, for the subtle plug there. Chuck actually does a lot of that work for us too. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a big reason why we do it, Thomas, is like, then you can kind of have your cake and eat it too, to make sure you have like a more senior person in place. I think obviously it sounds like your sales cycle is long. If your plan is to have these people ramp by Jan 1, 2022, my thought is, and you're going to hire 7 or 8, you already have 3. I think, look, if you hire in another 2 or 3 and you feel like you've got the profile right, I'm going to make a big assumption here.
Yeah.
If you don't have the profile right, then I might say, wait a little bit. Let's see how these 3 start to perform. Wait another month. If you do feel like, look, we've got these 3, they're actually performing in a fairly repeatable way, then I would feel more comfortable like saying, hey, continue to hire. So I would say the answer is it depends, is what we're both saying. The safest option is to wait, but sometimes we don't have that luxury. So my advice is, if you feel like you've got the hiring profile somewhat in a good place, then I'd feel more comfortable saying hire.
That's great guidance. I changed my answers.
Yeah, I sold Chuck. I sold Chuck on a new answer.
What you want to do, right?
All right, last question here. So again, we're talking to the 0 to 15. When you're hiring for an SDR to fill the pipeline, what are the qualities that you look for? How do you gauge them? Any specific industry experience? So this means sales development representative for any of you out there. These people usually are the people that are, going outbound, setting meetings, sometimes running some discovery calls, really kind of top of the funnel. Chuck, what do you look for? Like, what are the top kind of skills or experience sets or other things?
Yeah, I mean, I would have some more questions for the questioner in terms of the business specifics. But in general, I mean, if I'm hiring for sales development, industry experience is generally even less important than for other roles. I certainly want to hire for grit and resilience, like somebody who has a track record, whether it's in sales or in other work, in sort of overcoming adversity, and someone who's not easily rattled, because as we all know, I mean, sales development work, it's tough work, right? And there's going to be a learning curve, and then there's going to be getting after it, right? So, I want to hire people who aren't going to be, easily frustrated, people who have initiative as well, people who can communicate really well, and people who show like early signs of strong business acumen. I think that's these days is extremely important. Like, is this somebody, I think, particularly if this is a more complex, outbound SDR role, somebody who really can sort of understand our value prop and the way we help organizations, achieve business goals and outcomes. If I can find someone like that with grit and resilience and desire to be successful, that's usually a good recipe for success. What do you think, Jake?
I'm typing in this answer to this question since we won't have time to get to all of these. So Robert, I tried to answer your question in the chat there. So it's interesting. I think we talk a lot about the SDR role, right? Grit, hustle. And again, it goes back to the skills interview for me. And one of the skills that I look for is problem solving. And what I feel like, what you really need in a good SDR is to say, okay, here's how I'm doing this job. What's the outcomes that I'm getting? Okay, how do I produce more positive outcomes? And so I think problem solving skills is something that at an earlier stage in particular is mission critical. We did some assessment tests, Chuck, you'll appreciate this. We hired a shit ton of people, my first year as a VP. And so we started to do these kind of skills assessments. And what we found with the people, because again, it was a very value-based kind of, not straightforward. Most of the people that failed scored lower on like this had like math in it and some other things. And it was about problem solving. X plus 2 equals 4. What is X? Now it wasn't that basic, right? There was a little more complex than that, but and the people that even did have lower scores there, they over-index so much other and like these other like 3 or 4 areas that kind of compensated for some of it. So I just think that for me, the most underrated skill is problem solving.
Yeah.
And again, it's demonstrated experience doing it. Because usually I find people that are good at problem solving, again, like what's that Bill Gates saying? Or not, maybe it's not Bill Gates. I think it's Steve Jobs. It's like I hire a lazy person to do hard jobs or something like that. And so that's what I find out from problem solvers.
Yeah, that's a good call out. And I think particularly given the tech available today, I mean, you want people who, if they're doing, A/B testing and the like, they can really, analyze the results and make adjustments and improve and continue to iterate, right?
Exactly right. And then we got a bonus question. What's up, Paula? Hope you're doing great. What is more important, being great at sales or industry? It's impossible to get into SaaS. What advice could you give for anyone wanting to do that?
Say the question again, Jake.
It's impossible to get into SaaS basically if you don't have the experience.
Yeah, I mean it's an unfortunate. It shouldn't be that difficult, right? So this is where I think it's unfortunate. I think many hiring managers get too focused on these buzzwords. I mean, what I would say in general, if you're trying to break in, is become a part of these SaaS communities. They're so readily available these days. I mean, join Rev Genius, right? Get on LinkedIn, start commenting and engaging others.
Start putting out content that's about SaaS sales, even if you haven't been in it before.
Exactly. I mean, that's the best step forward. I think, you get yourself on that playing field. And I think that's more possible now than it was in the past. But, unfortunately, again, some hiring managers, they work in narrow boxes.
It's got to be that one way, right? Yeah. It's got to be. But I'm with you. I love that idea. Yeah. Again, get involved in these communities. Start talking about SaaS sales. If I see you out there and for the last month or whatever, you've been talking about this thing, who cares? I can see you get it. It's like, I always tell this people, it's like, you got to show me you get it before you get the at bat. And too many people want the at bat and then they want to show you. And that's just not how life works. I was talking about, it's like everyone wants a fire. They don't want to go grab the firewood. You got to show that you can go build a fire first, and you start with the firewood and how to make a fire, versus, well, give me the opportunity. And then, so I think, there's a lot of different ways. Again, like you said, get involved in Rev Genius, start to hop in that Slack channel, start, commenting on things, or, a sales hacker, or any of these. There's some, a lot of different opportunities that you could, join. So, you got to go make it happen. So Chuck, thank you, my friend. We went a little bit over, but I think we answered a lot of questions for people. So hopefully everyone out there, if you're hiring from 0 to 15, you can go back, you can watch this and replay it. Next week, I'm talking with my friend, Matt Cameron. We're talking about leadership hiring. So we're talking about, okay, we've hired these 0 to 15 and we've started the scaling process to 20 million and beyond. How do we think about leadership hiring and development? Chuck and I touched on this a little bit because it's pretty pathetic. I would say is like the best leadership development in startup land. I'd say is pretty pathetic. Yeah. So we'll dive into that. And Chuck, I wanted to thank you again, man. I really enjoyed the conversation, and we will see everyone on Friday. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.